The concrete bulkhead of the Stargate wing tears outward like a breached tomb, metal ribs twisting as alarms scream and half the lights drop into darkness. And in that sudden collapse of order, a figure steps through the event horizon as though emerging from a shadow already cast. He is not wearing the uniform anyone expects, and he does not hesitate or search for bearings. Instead, he studies the ruined corridor with a clinical calm, every movement measured before it happens. Rifles fire toward his silhouette and find only empty space where something moves faster than a reflex, and the first body that falls to his shadow-touch blade does not cry out so much as go still, like a system powered down. This is not an arrival meant for study or diplomacy, but an intrusion that forces command to choose between containment and annihilation, and the ripple beginning in that damaged hall will not remain inside this base. This is only the beginning, and worse is already forming. Stay with this unfolding moment and subscribe once if you intend to witness what follows, because the decision already taking shape inside this base will carry consequences far beyond it, and turning away now will not prevent the outcome that has already begun. When the blast doors slammed shut inside the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, it wasn't because of an incoming off-world threat or a Goa'uld incursion, but because the Stargate itself had dialed without authorization and remained active beyond any known protocol. Its event horizon pulsing with an unstable waveform that Dr. Samantha Carter could not match to any known stellar address. The technicians on duty had already begun containment procedures when the MALP camera feed cut out mid-transmission, not to static, but to complete data erasure, as if whatever had crossed the threshold had consumed the signal itself before stepping through into Earth's atmosphere. General Jack O'Neill didn't wait for confirmation before ordering SG-1 to the gate room, because by then the internal pressure sensors in the access corridor had dropped sharply, and the reinforced bulkhead leading to the arrival platform had buckled inward as though struck by a kinetic force far exceeding explosive yield. Security teams moved to intercept, expecting anything from a replicator drone to a rogue Jaffa strike unit. But the man who emerged from the dissipating glow was alone, and moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had already calculated the outcome of every engagement in the room. Sung Jin-Woo did not announce himself or hesitate, and when the first guard attempted to restrain him with a taser, the result was not a scuffle but an immediate collapse as the contact point blackened with something that did not resemble electrical burn. Colonel Cameron Mitchell raised his weapon and shouted for the intruder to stand down, but the command was ignored because Jin-Woo had already shifted position without visible acceleration, placing himself between two converging teams as if anticipating their trajectory seconds before they moved. SGC protocol demanded non-lethal containment for unknown humanoid arrivals, and Daniel Jackson was already calling for translation clearance, assuming the figure might be a displaced human from an unregistered colony. But Carter noticed something else entirely as the environmental monitors began to spike with an energy signature that did not match Nakwata radiation or any Goa'uld-derived technology. It was a monodensity curve, though she did not have the vocabulary for it yet, and it pressed against the walls with a gravitational insistence that caused several soldiers to stagger even before the first shadow moved. When Jin-Woo's blade cut through the reinforced barrel of a rifle as though it were paper, the room fell into a stunned silence that lasted only until the severed weapon struck the floor. Containment foam was deployed, flooding the lower platform in expanding polymer, but Jin-Woo did not retreat or panic. He stepped through it with deliberate ease, as though the substance had no authority over his movement, and placed a single hand against the shoulder of the nearest unconscious guard. No one in the command room understood what they were witnessing when the man's shadow peeled upward from the floor like a living stain, stretching beyond the limits of physics before snapping back into shape behind Jin-Woo's silhouette. The resulting entity did not resemble a human so much as a memory of one, armored in black distortion and standing at attention, as if awaiting orders it already understood. General O'Neill's voice cut through the chaos as he ordered a full lockdown of levels 26 through 28. But by then, the first Shadow soldier had moved, intercepting a stun round mid-flight with an arm that absorbed the kinetic impact without visible reaction. Teal'c, recognizing a battlefield hierarchy when he saw one, stepped forward with his staff weapon lowered but ready, watching Jin-Woo with the measured suspicion he once reserved for system lords. Because whatever this man was, he carried himself with the assurance of command rather than desperation. Jin-Woo's gaze passed over the assembled personnel without lingering, calculating threat vectors instead of seeking escape routes, and when his eyes settled briefly on the Stargate itself, Carter realized he was not surprised by it in the slightest. The decision to escalate to lethal force was debated for less than 5 seconds before the automated turrets activated, tracking the Shadow entities now multiplying along the platform, as each fallen soldier provided another anchor point for extraction. Daniel shouted for a ceasefire as he realized the bodies were not being consumed, but repurposed, their silhouettes rising in obedience to a monarchical presence that radiated psychological pressure even through reinforced glass. Jin-Woo did not summon endlessly. Each new soldier seemed to draw from a finite reserve, his posture tightening slightly with the expenditure. But the pace of the growth was enough to turn a containment scenario into a defensive retreat within minutes. As G1 was forced back toward the upper gantry, as the first wave of Shadows moved in disciplined formation, not attacking indiscriminately but targeting weapons systems and access points with tactical precision that implied battlefield experience far beyond Earth's recorded history. Carter's attempts to shut down the gate remotely failed as the control crystals registered interference that did not correspond to any known energy spectrum, and the dialing computer began cycling through addresses without command input. Somewhere in the network, something had recognized Jin-Woo's presence and responded not with curiosity but with activation. As the event horizon flared again without a dial sequence, Teal'c spoke the word that no one wanted to hear, identifying the outgoing signal as one consistent with Goa'uld emergency summoning protocols, which meant that whatever had just arrived on Earth was now being advertised across interstellar territory as a potential rival power. Jin-Woo turned toward the reactivating Stargate as the first Shadow Knight formed at his side, and for the first time since his arrival, the atmosphere in the gate room shifted from confusion to impending invasion. By the time the Stargate's event horizon stabilized for the second time without a dialed address, the situation inside the gate room had already transitioned from a containment failure to an active territorial defense, because the Shadows now occupying the lower platform were no longer reacting to incoming fire, but repositioning in anticipation of something about to arrive. Dr. Carter had lost primary command of the dialing computer as unfamiliar command loops began overriding manual shutdown attempts, and the symbols cycling across the interface corresponded not to Earth's outgoing traffic, but to an external request that had bypassed all known authentication layers. General O'Neill did not need Teal'c's confirmation to understand what that meant, because the last time the gate had responded this way, a system lord had been on the other end expecting tribute or submission. Jin-Woo did not move to escape the base or negotiate terms. Instead, he stepped closer to the forming horizon with the calm deliberation of someone recognizing a battlefield expansion rather than an opportunity to retreat, and the Shadows arrayed behind him mirrored that readiness with unnerving discipline. Colonel Mitchell ordered SG-1 to maintain distance as the first silhouette pushed through the liquid surface of the gate, not a reconnaissance drone but a full Jaffa warrior in ceremonial armor, staff weapon already raised in expectation of resistance. The Jaffa had time to register confusion at the sight of Earth personnel, holding defensive positions before his attention snapped toward Jin-Woo, whose presence in the room seemed to exert a pressure that bypassed language entirely and settled somewhere deeper in the brainstem. The staff blast discharged on instinct rather than command, striking one of the shadow soldiers in the chest and passing through it in a flare of light that dissipated harmlessly across its form. But the retaliation was immediate as the entity closed the distance with a speed that forced the second Jaffa to fire blindly. Teal'c recognized the armor markings even before the crest became visible through the gate's rippling surface, identifying the arrival party as belonging to a minor Goa'uld vassal operating under emergency summons, which meant they had come expecting to either assist or exploit a destabilized world. What they encountered instead was a battlefield already claimed by something that did not register on their theological hierarchy. Jin-Woo did not issue a verbal command when the first Jaffa fell. The Shadow Knight beside him moved as though responding to an internal directive, its blade cutting through the warrior's armor at the joint and leaving him collapsed across the ramp with a wound that would have been instantly fatal under any biological standard. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened beyond the body settling, and then the shadow beneath it began to distort, stretching toward Jin-Woo's feet with a tension that caused several SGC personnel to recoil. Daniel Jackson attempted to shout a warning that the Goa'uld symbiote might still be viable, but the extraction process did not pause for biological nuance as the silhouette tore free and reformed into something that retained the outline of Jaffa physiology while abandoning every recognizable feature. The newly formed Shadow Jaffa rose without ceremony, its staff weapon now clutched in a grip that suggested memory without loyalty, and turned toward the Stargate as additional warriors emerged into a situation they had not been briefed to understand. Carter's reading spiked again as the mana density in the room increased with each successful extraction, and she realized with growing urgency that whatever system governed Jin-Woo's army was scaling, in response to off-world reinforcements rather than Earth-based casualties. This was no longer a question of containing an intruder. It was a feedback loop between interstellar military response and an expanding shadow force that treated every new arrival as both threat and resource. General O'Neill authorized live rounds against the incoming Jaffa as the situation deteriorated, but the engagement quickly fractured into overlapping conflicts because the Shadows prioritized off-world combatants while avoiding unnecessary contact with SGC personnel, as if operating under a selective threat matrix. Teal'c stepped into the line of fire to intercept a blast aimed at Carter, his staff weapon deflecting the shot with practiced precision, but even he hesitated when a fallen Jaffa at his feet began to rise again under Jin-Woo's silent command. The psychological impact of watching a former brother-in-arms stand in blackened obedience was not lost on him, and it was enough to confirm that this was not a Goa'uld technology or Takra experiment gone wrong. Through it all, Jin-Woo remained focused on the gate itself, his posture tightening incrementally with each new summon as the strain of maintaining the growing army became visible in the set of his shoulders. He did not flood the room with shadows indiscriminately, instead allowing the engagement to escalate in a controlled pattern that preserved his reserves while maximizing battlefield conversion. Carter, watching the exchange from the control room, realized that the intruder was not attempting to conquer Earth so much as establish a defensive perimeter against whatever had initiated the off-world summons. When the Stargate flared again with the unmistakable golden shimmer of a Goa'uld command transmission, Teal'c spoke the name that reframed the entire encounter, identifying the incoming signal as one associated with a system lord known for rapid territorial acquisition following emergent threats. Jin-Woo's gaze sharpened at the change in energy profile, and the shadows shifted formation in response, preparing for an arrival that would not be content with reconnaissance or ritual intimidation. The emergency briefing did not wait for the gate room to be secured, because by the time the last of the incoming Jaffa had either been neutralized or converted into shadow-bound assets, The reality of what had occurred beneath Cheyenne Mountain was already propagating through the highest levels of Earth's command infrastructure. General O'Neill stood at the head of the conference table with SG-1 present and visibly divided, while the live feed from the gate room showed Sung Jin-Woo positioned just beyond the ramp, surrounded by a reduced but intact formation of shadows that had not advanced further into the facility. He had made no attempt to escape custody since the off-world engagement ended, yet every security measure around him had been doubled, not because of aggression, but because of potential. Dr. Samantha Carter presented the preliminary analysis with the precision of someone aware that every word would influence policy, explaining that the energy signature associated with Jin-Woo's abilities did not correspond to any known Goa'uld, ancient, or Asgard technology. It behaved less like a device and more like an environmental field anchored to his biological presence, which meant that any attempt to isolate or disarm him would require containment methods that had never been tested on a sentient power source. Daniel Jackson raised the obvious ethical concerns about treating a human-appearing individual as a strategic asset rather than a diplomatic contact, but those objections were quickly overshadowed by the video footage of fallen Jaffa rising in obedient formation behind him. The Pentagon liaison attending via secure uplink did not bother with abstraction, referring to Jin-Woo directly as a non-terrestrial anomaly whose presence had already triggered a Goa'uld reconnaissance response within minutes of arrival. From a geopolitical standpoint, that made him either a defensive advantage or a planetary liability, depending on whether Stargate Command could establish operational cooperation before word spread to other system lords. Teal'c confirmed that the theological implications of a rival entity capable of reanimating Jaffa would not go unnoticed, because in Goa'uld doctrine, control over life and death was an explicit marker of godhood. Jin-Woo himself did not participate in the briefing, but the audio feed from the observation chamber captured his first verbal exchange with SGC personnel when Colonel Mitchell attempted to clarify his intentions. He did not deny responsibility for the Shadow Army or the engagement with the incoming Jaffa, and he did not offer alliance in return for protection. Instead, he asked a single operational question regarding the range of Stargate-connected territories and the classification of species known to initiate hostile incursions. The request was not framed as curiosity, but as threat assessment, which shifted the tone of the debate from containment to coordination almost immediately. Earth governments were notified in staggered tiers to prevent premature disclosure, but the intelligence summaries circulating among NATO representatives already framed Jin-Woo as a strategic wildcard, whose cooperation could redefine planetary defense. The concern was not whether he could repel a Goa'uld landing force, but whether the visibility of his shadow army across multiple off-world engagements would provoke a coalition response from races interpreting his presence as an emergent system lord analog. Carter's projections indicated that repeated shadow-based victories could create a perception cascade in which alien civilizations treated Earth as the seat of a new Monarch-tier entity. Meanwhile, in the gate room below, the shadows had not dispersed but repositioned along the perimeter in a posture that resembled defensive occupation rather than imprisonment. Jin-Woo remained calm and observant, his attention fixed on the Stargate as though anticipating another activation, and when the environmental sensors registered a gradual increase in mana density across the chamber, Carter realized that maintaining the army was not cost-free. The strain was subtle but measurable, suggesting that his ability to sustain large-scale summons would degrade under prolonged multi-front conflict. The oversight debate intensified when an NID representative proposed integrating Jin-Woo into a controlled off-world deployment to test the limits of his extraction capability against non-humanoid biology. Daniel objected immediately to what amounted to battlefield experimentation, but the counterargument was framed in terms of necessity, because the next species to arrive through the gate might not be compatible with shadow conversion at all. If Jin-Woo's power depended on battlefield death conditions that varied by physiology, then SGC needed that data before committing him to a defensive role. As if responding to the discussion above, the Stargate in the chamber began to rotate again without a dialed input, the chevrons locking in a sequence that Carter did not recognize from any Goa'uld address database. Jin-Woo rose from his seated position before the alarm sounded, and the shadows shifted into formation as the event horizon flared with a waveform that was neither golden nor blue, but something deeper and more saturated. The incoming wormhole did not stabilize with the familiar aqueous ripple that SGC personnel had come to associate with Goa'uld or even ancient transit, but with a denser, almost viscous distortion that caused the surrounding instrumentation to register atmospheric fluctuations well beyond acceptable thresholds. Dr. Carter's console began flagging pressure anomalies not just within the gate room, but along the upper levels of the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, as though the connection being established was exerting stress on the facility's structural envelope. General O'Neill issued an immediate evacuation order for non-essential personnel on levels 25 through 27, but the directive was overtaken by events when the first form forced its way through the horizon without waiting for full stabilization. It was not a Jaffa or a human silhouette emerging onto the ramp, but something elongated and armored in chitinous plating that reflected the overhead lights in irregular patterns, its movement less like a soldier's advance and more like a predator adjusting to a new gravity field. Teal'c did not recognize the species, which in itself was enough to disrupt the working assumption that this was a Goa'uld-led incursion, and Daniel Jackson's attempt to classify the arrival based on limb articulation was cut short when the creature released a sonic pulse that shattered 2 observation panels on the upper gantry. The breach did not begin at the Stargate. It began in the command level above as the pressure differential translated into microfractures along the ventilation shafts. Security teams attempting to seal the gate room found themselves dealing with secondary entry points as smaller variants of the same organism forced their way through compromised ducts, their physiology seemingly adapted for infiltration rather than frontal assault. Carter's readings indicated that their biological makeup did not align with any database entry from previous SG missions, and more critically, their neural activity persisted for several seconds after terminal trauma, suggesting that battlefield death conditions might not trigger immediate shadow extraction. Jin-Woo did not hesitate to engage, but his first successful strike resulted in a delay that forced him to remain within range of the creature's counterattack longer than anticipated. The shadows responded with disciplined aggression, intercepting the larger organism before it could advance beyond the ramp, but their blades encountered resistance that did not behave like conventional armor, and the engagement produced an audible vibration that carried into the corridor beyond. Colonel Mitchell led a containment team toward the ventilation breach, only to find that the infiltration units were already spreading into the administrative levels, prioritizing power relays and communication nodes with a coordination that implied hive-level command. This was not a scouting party. It was an insertion designed to compromise infrastructure before a larger deployment. Jin-Woo's second extraction attempt yielded partial results as the shadow beneath a fallen infiltration unit stretched and then recoiled, reforming into a distorted echo that lacked the cohesion of his earlier summons. The resulting entity moved with reduced stability, its form flickering at the edges as though struggling to reconcile an unfamiliar biological template, and Carter immediately recognized the implication that non-human physiology could degrade the effectiveness of the Shadow Army over time. Mana expenditure spiked sharply with each attempt, forcing Jin-Woo to prioritize engagements where conversion was more likely to succeed. Above ground, the consequences of the breach began to manifest as power fluctuations rippled through Colorado Springs, triggering emergency grid failsafes that shut down civilian infrastructure across multiple districts. The infiltration units had reached the external conduit network before SGC could isolate the damage, and the resulting outages created a cascade of alarms that drew local law enforcement into a situation they were not cleared to understand. Earth governments had debated oversight in the abstract only hours earlier. Now they were facing the prospect of an off-world incursion manifesting in a civilian population center. Teal'c returned to the gate room in time to see Jin-Woo reposition his remaining stable shadows along the ramp, conceding the upper levels to Mitchell's team while preparing for additional arrivals through the still-active wormhole. The psychological pressure in the chamber intensified as more of the chitinous organisms began to emerge, their arrival no longer tentative but coordinated, and Carter's console registered a transmission embedded within the energy waveform that did not match any known linguistic pattern. The decision to involve National Military Command was not delayed by classification protocol this time, because the rolling blackout across Colorado Springs had already triggered civilian emergency response networks that could not be silenced without drawing attention to the source. Within 20 minutes of the first confirmed infrastructure failure, NORAD received a Level 1 advisory from Stargate Command, indicating an active off-world biological incursion with unknown replication capacity, and the language of the directive avoided speculation about origin while emphasizing the immediate need for perimeter containment. General O'Neill authorized partial disclosure to the Joint Chiefs under the justification that whatever had breached the ventilation grid beneath Cheyenne Mountain was now operating beyond SGC's internal jurisdiction. Colonel Mitchell's team reported contact with infiltration units in 3 separate administrative corridors, each engagement confirming that the organisms were not acting randomly, but targeting environmental controls and power routing junctions that would complicate any attempt to isolate the gate room. Their movement patterns suggested distributed command rather than centralized leadership, which in turn raised the possibility that additional arrivals through the Stargate might function as coordination nodes. Carter relayed the data to Jin-Woo through the observation chamber's intercom, not as a request for assistance, but as an operational update, because by then it had become clear that he did not respond to orders without a defined threat benefit. Jin-Woo acknowledged the information with a brief nod and began reallocating his remaining stable shadows toward the upper access ramps, but the adjustment came with visible strain as the mana density in the room fluctuated under the increased load. He did not attempt to replace the unstable constructs derived from the alien infiltration units, instead allowing them to dissipate as he focused on engagements where extraction success rates were higher. The Shadow Jaffa formed during the earlier incursion moved to intercept a cluster of organisms advancing toward the secondary elevator shaft, their staff weapons now repurposed under a command hierarchy that did not require verbal instruction. Outside the mountain, Air Force security detachments established a cordon around the primary access road as reports of electrical fires began to surface across adjacent districts, each incident tracing back to conduit nodes that had been compromised from below. Civilian authorities were instructed to attribute the outages to a transformer cascade, while National Guard units mobilized under the pretext of wildfire response. But the scale of the deployment risked drawing satellite attention from off-world observers already monitoring Earth's electromagnetic profile. The oversight debate that had occupied the briefing room hours earlier was replaced by a directive to prevent visual confirmation of any shadow-based entities beyond the base perimeter. Teal'c accompanied a joint SGC, National Guard team into the compromised ventilation hub, where they encountered a concentration of infiltration units attempting to breach the external communications uplink, and the engagement revealed a new complication as the organisms began secreting a conductive resin that interfered with radio transmission. Daniel Jackson, monitoring from the command center, noted that the behavior resembled pre-assault isolation tactics observed in certain Goa'uld-engineered species, though the morphology did not match any recorded variant. This was not a simple incursion, it was an adaptive one. Jin-Woo arrived at the hub via shadow exchange, choosing the moment of highest enemy density rather than deploying preemptively, and the resulting engagement stabilized the corridor long enough for Mitchell's team to deploy thermal charges along the resin-coated junctions. The extraction attempts that followed yielded mixed results, with several shadows forming only to destabilize seconds later, each failure corresponding to a measurable increase in Jin-Woo's mana expenditure. Carter warned that sustained multi-front conversion under these conditions could degrade his operational capacity before the primary arrival force had even manifested. As the charges detonated and the corridor sealed, the Stargate below remained active, its event horizon pulsing with the same saturated waveform that had accompanied the initial breach, and the transmission embedded within it intensified into a repeating signal that Carter could no longer treat as noise. Whatever was on the other side was not merely deploying infiltration units. It was announcing a presence that expected Earth to respond. The first indication that the situation had escalated beyond terrestrial containment came not from the gate room or the compromised ventilation network, but from an off-world sensor array maintained under Asgard Treaty oversight, which registered a spike in subspace distortion directly above Earth's equatorial orbit less than an hour after the infiltration units breached Cheyenne Mountain. Stargate Command received the alert through encrypted diplomatic channels that bypassed conventional NORAD routing, and Dr. Carter was already correlating the timing with the embedded transmission from the active wormhole when General O'Neill authorized a full-spectrum scan of near-Earth space. The distortion did not correspond to a Goa'uld mothership signature or any Takra cloaking field, but its persistence suggested an observer maintaining position rather than a transient flyby. Daniel Jackson interpreted the data as evidence that the incursion had drawn attention from an external power with the capability to monitor interstellar anomalies in real time, which reframed the infiltration event as a beacon rather than an isolated assault. Teal'c did not dispute the conclusion, noting that any species capable of detecting mana-equivalent emissions would interpret Jin-Woo's shadow army as an emergent rival within the same operational tier as a system lord or worse. The theological implications were secondary to the tactical reality that Earth was now under surveillance by a force that had not yet committed to direct engagement. Within the mountain, Jin-Woo continued to ration his summons with deliberate restraint, allowing the Shadow Jaffa and his more stable constructs to handle corridor defense, while he repositioned toward the gate room in anticipation of a larger arrival. The mana strain associated with repeated partial extractions had not diminished, and Carter's readings indicated a gradual reduction in his reserve that would become critical if the engagement extended beyond a single planetary theater. He did not attempt to conceal the limitation, but neither did he adjust his posture in a way that suggested retreat. Colonel Mitchell reported that the infiltration units were withdrawing from secondary objectives and converging on the primary power trunk feeding the gate room, which implied a shift from infrastructure compromise to energy acquisition. The behavior aligned with Carter's earlier hypothesis that the organisms were preparing for a coordination node to arrive, potentially one capable of interfacing directly with Earth's power grid to sustain further deployment. National Guard engineers attempting to isolate the trunk encountered resistance in the form of resin-sealed conduits that had hardened to the consistency of ceramic under ambient heat. Above ground, Air Force radar began tracking a stationary contact in low orbit that emitted intermittent pulses matching the saturated waveform of the active wormhole, and the correlation forced the Joint Chiefs to consider the possibility that the observer was not merely watching, but synchronizing with the incursion below. The oversight directive expanded to include aerospace defense readiness, though no intercept could be authorized without confirmation of hostile intent. Earth governments that had argued for cooperative engagement hours earlier now faced the prospect of an off-world presence, evaluating their response latency in real time. Jin-Woo reached the gate room as the power trunk alarms escalated, and the shadows formed a defensive ring around the ramp without prompting, their posture reflecting a hierarchy that had adapted to off-world engagement parameters. Carter informed him of the orbital contact through the observation feed, framing it as a potential secondary threat vector, and his response was limited to a brief shift in attention toward the ceiling, as though acknowledging a battlefield extension he could not yet reach. The embedded transmission within the wormhole intensified again, its repeating signal now accompanied by fluctuations in the event horizon that suggested imminent transit. As the first chevron began to glow with an internal light not generated by SGC systems, Teal'c recognized the pattern as one associated with forced gate override, a technique rarely employed outside of full-scale invasion protocols. The observer in orbit had not acted, but something on the other side of the gate had decided that Earth's response warranted escalation. By the time the first forced override locked into place, Stargate Command had already exhausted every internal protocol designed to prevent unscheduled inbound transit, because the chevrons were no longer responding to Earth-side commands, but to a synchronization sequence embedded within the saturated waveform itself. Dr. Carter's console displayed an energy profile that climbed past the threshold associated with standard matter reintegration, and she realized with mounting urgency that whatever was attempting to cross would not be constrained by the usual gate room spatial tolerances. General O'Neill ordered all remaining personnel to fall back to secondary defensive positions, but the directive came too late to prevent the initial displacement of air as the horizon bulged outward into the chamber. Jin-Woo did not retreat with the others. Instead, he advanced to the edge of the ramp where the shadows had formed their defensive ring, positioning himself at the point of highest projected impact. The mana density around him surged in response to the imminent arrival, not as an uncontrolled flare, but as a deliberate allocation that caused several of his less stable constructs to dissolve preemptively. Carter's readings indicated that he was consolidating his reserves for a single engagement, rather than attempting to match the scale of the incursion with additional summons, which aligned with his earlier pattern of tactical restraint under strain. Colonel Mitchell's team reported simultaneous breaches along the sealed ventilation network as infiltration units abandoned their earlier objectives and began converging on the gate room from above. Their movement coordinated with the override sequence in a way that suggested direct command linkage. Teal'c identified the behavior as preparatory encirclement, a tactic designed to isolate a high-value target before the arrival of a superior entity, and the implication that Jin-Woo himself had become that target was not lost on anyone present. Daniel Jackson attempted to raise the possibility of disengagement, but the active wormhole eliminated any viable evacuation route without ceding the facility entirely. The arrival itself did not resemble a conventional troop deployment. It was a mass of interlocking chitin and luminescent tissue that forced its way through the event horizon in sections, each segment anchoring to the ramp before the next emerged in a cascading sequence. The pressure differential cracked the outer ring of the Stargate's housing, sending fragments skidding across the platform, as the organism's full mass began to coalesce into a form that dwarfed the earlier infiltration units. Carter's instruments failed to classify its neural activity as singular, instead registering a distributed pattern that pulsed in sync with the orbital contact, now maintaining a fixed position above Earth. Jin-Woo engaged at the moment of partial cohesion, his blade intersecting one of the organism's anchoring limbs with enough force to sever it at the joint. But the resulting collapse did not produce the immediate stillness required for successful extraction. The shadow beneath the fallen segment stretched toward him and then recoiled violently, dissipating into a distortion that left no viable construct behind, and the mana expenditure associated with the attempt registered as a sharp drop in his reserve. This was not a failure of technique, but of compatibility, confirming Carter's earlier concern that non-human biology could resist shadow integration entirely. The shadows responded with coordinated strikes against the organism's exposed nodes, prioritizing mobility impairment over structural destruction, and their success in pinning two of its limbs bought Mitchell's team enough time to deploy shaped charges along the ramp. The detonations sheared away additional mass, but each severed section continued to exhibit residual activity, forcing Jin-Woo to expend further energy in containment rather than conversion. Teal'c moved to intercept a secondary limb extending toward the upper gantry, his staff weapon discharging at close range to disrupt its advance. Above the mountain, the orbital contact emitted a sustained pulse that caused Carter's console to spike across every monitored spectrum, and the embedded transmission within the wormhole shifted from repetition to modulation. The observer had begun to respond to the engagement below, and the synchronization between orbit and gate room tightened into a feedback loop that threatened to overwhelm the facility's remaining structural integrity. The sustained orbital pulse did not arrive as an abstract sensor anomaly this time, but as a measurable shift in the gravitational gradient across Cheyenne Mountain, subtle at first, and then escalating into a pressure that forced unsecured equipment to slide across the gate room floor. Dr. Carter's console began returning impossible readings as the waveform from above synchronized with the active wormhole below, effectively turning the facility into a resonant chamber for whatever interaction was now underway. General O'Neill ordered a structural integrity assessment that no one had time to complete, because the interlocking organism on the ramp responded to the orbital signal by accelerating its cohesion, its segmented mass drawing inward as though receiving a command that bypassed local stimuli entirely. Jin-Woo adjusted his stance rather than summoning additional shadows, consolidating the remaining stable constructs into a tighter formation that abandoned the outer corridors to Mitchell's team in favor of protecting the immediate gate room perimeter. The decision carried operational risk, but Carter's earlier warning regarding mana depletion had not been theoretical, and the drain associated with failed extractions had already reduced his margin for sustained multi-front engagement. He did not attempt to force compatibility with the organism's severed segments again, instead redirecting his shadows toward immobilization tactics that mirrored conventional military doctrine more than supernatural assault. Teal'c recognized the shift immediately, noting that the shadows were now operating as a holding force rather than an advancing one, their objective narrowed to preventing the organism from achieving full articulation within the chamber. Daniel Jackson relayed the observation to the command center, framing it as evidence that Jin-Woo was adapting his engagement parameters in response to an enemy that could not be converted into additional manpower. This was no longer a question of army growth through conflict escalation. It was a dominance test between two incompatible command hierarchies competing for control of the same battlefield. Colonel Mitchell's team reported that the infiltration units in the ventilation network had ceased their advance and begun reinforcing the primary breach from above, their chitinous forms anchoring along the fractured ceiling, as though awaiting a signal from the organism below. The behavior aligned with Carter's projection that the larger entity functioned as a coordination node, capable of directing subordinate units through a shared neural lattice that extended beyond the immediate facility. The implication that this lattice might also interface with the orbital contact introduced a strategic variable that SGC had never been forced to consider in real time. Jin-Woo engaged the organism's central mass with a sequence of strikes that prioritized joint articulation over exposed tissue, forcing it to expend energy on stabilization rather than forward movement, and the shadows followed with synchronized assaults that pinned two of its limbs against the ramp. The maneuver did not destroy the entity, but it disrupted its ability to anchor additional segments through the wormhole, slowing the rate of arrival to a level that Carter could track without losing resolution. Each successful immobilization corresponded to a marginal reduction in the gravitational fluctuation within the chamber. Above ground, Air Force radar registered a second contact entering low orbit, its emission pattern matching the first with a delay that suggested coordinated deployment rather than independent observation. The Joint Chiefs authorized aerospace defense readiness at DEFCON 3, though no intercept vector could be established against a target that had not yet manifested a physical hull. Earth governments that had debated oversight now faced the prospect of an off-world force, conducting a layered evaluation of planetary defenses. As the organism's central node began emitting a counterfrequency that caused the shadows, forms to flicker at the edges, Carter realized that the dominance test was no longer confined to the gate room, because the modulation was propagating through the mana field itself. Jin-Woo's posture tightened in response, not from hesitation, but from the recognition that whatever intelligence was directing the incursion had begun to interact with the mechanics of his army. The modulation spreading through the mana field did not behave like an electromagnetic countermeasure or a Goa'uld dampening field, because it did not attempt to suppress Jin-Woo's summons directly. Instead, it altered the environment in which those summons existed, introducing a dissonance that caused several shadow soldiers to lose cohesion along their extremities. Dr. Carter watched the degradation curve in real time and understood that whatever intelligence had synchronized orbit with gate transit was not attacking the army itself, but the rules governing its stability, which meant the conflict had escalated beyond physical dominance into systemic interference. General O'Neill ordered Mitchell's team to withdraw from the upper gantry as the organism's central node began emitting a sustained harmonic that resonated through the fractured Stargate housing. Jin-Woo did not respond by expanding his forces. He reduced them, allowing unstable constructs to dissipate while drawing his more resilient shadows inward, consolidating command around a smaller, denser formation that could withstand the environmental distortion. The decision preserved mana but conceded territory within the chamber, and the organism exploited the opening by extending a newly formed limb toward the secondary power trunk feeding the gate room's control systems. Teal'c intercepted the advance with a close-range staff discharge, buying seconds rather than minutes, but the delay allowed Jin-Woo to reposition via shadow exchange into the path of the central node itself. Daniel Jackson attempted to classify the entity as a possible hive intelligence analogous to Wraith command structures, but the neural readings Carter relayed did not indicate distributed cognition so much as layered presence, as though multiple directives were being issued from a single origin point that did not reside entirely within the organism's physical mass. The implication that the orbital contacts might serve as external processing nodes forced SGC to consider the possibility that the engagement below was merely an interface for something operating at a higher tier of command. Jin-Woo's blade intersected the central node with enough force to disrupt its emission pattern, and for a fraction of a second the mana field stabilized, allowing one of the Shadow Jaffa to sever a supporting limb at the joint. The fallen segment collapsed onto the ramp and remained inert long enough for an extraction attempt that produced a partial construct, its form flickering but coherent enough to hold position against the organism's advance. The success came at a measurable cost, as Carter's console registered a significant drop in Jin-Woo's reserve, confirming that even compatible conversions under these conditions required disproportionate expenditure. Above Earth, the two orbital contacts shifted into a synchronized formation that produced a third emission pattern, one that Carter could not map to any known spectrum, and the resulting pulse translated into a pressure wave that rippled through the gate room floor. The organism responded by accelerating its regeneration, drawing mass from the still-active wormhole in a flow that bypassed the earlier immobilization tactics. Mitchell's team reported structural failure along the outer ring of the Stargate, as additional segments forced their way through the compromised housing. Teal'c identified the emission pattern as consistent with a command assertion, rather than a defensive adaptation, noting that in Goa'uld doctrine, such a signal would precede the arrival of a system lord seeking to establish dominance over an emergent rival. The difference here was that no physical vessel had yet entered the atmosphere, and the battlefield remained confined to a chamber beneath a mountain that was no longer structurally sound. Jin-Woo adjusted his grip on the blade as the mana field around him thickened under the renewed pulse, the shadows tightening their formation in response. And Carter realized that the next escalation would not involve additional troops, but a presence capable of interfacing with both the organism and the orbital nodes simultaneously. The third emission pattern did not remain confined to the gate room for long, because within seconds of its release, the saturated waveform began propagating through the facility's structural framework, turning Cheyenne Mountain itself into a conduit for a signal that bypassed every known shielding protocol. Dr. Carter's instruments registered localized fluctuations in the mana density along load-bearing corridors 2 levels above the Stargate, and the correlation between those spikes and the organism's regeneration cycle confirmed that the orbital contacts were no longer observing or synchronizing from a distance. They were interacting directly with the battlefield through the environment, using the facility's own architecture as a medium for command reinforcement. Colonel Mitchell attempted to seal the outer access tunnels as microfractures began to spread along the reinforced concrete, but the effort was overtaken by a cascade of system failures that cut power to the secondary blast doors before they could lock. The infiltration units that had withdrawn earlier now reappeared along the newly compromised seams, their chitinous forms forcing gaps wide enough for additional mass to seep through from the gate room below. This was no longer an incursion limited to a single chamber. It was a structural invasion that treated the mountain as an extension of the organism's growth field. Jin-Woo's shadows responded with disciplined repositioning, abandoning peripheral engagements in favor of maintaining a defensive corridor between the Stargate and the primary command level. But the consolidation came at the cost of territorial control across the lower facility. The partial construct derived from the earlier extraction flickered under the sustained harmonic, its cohesion degrading until it collapsed into inert shadow along the floor, and Carter's console reflected the expenditure with a drop that brought Jin-Woo's reserve into a critical range. He did not attempt to replace it, instead focusing on preventing the organism's central node from achieving full articulation within the gate room. Teal'c and a joint SGC, National Guard unit fell back from the ventilation hub as the resin-coated conduits began to fracture outward, releasing additional infiltration variants that moved toward the surface access points with coordinated urgency. Daniel Jackson, monitoring the retreat from the command center, realized that the organisms were no longer prioritizing power relays or communication nodes, but exit vectors that would allow them to reach civilian infrastructure beyond the base perimeter. The blackout across Colorado Springs had already drawn emergency services into the vicinity, and the risk of visual contact with off-world biology was no longer theoretical. Above ground, Air Force radar registered a transient drop in atmospheric pressure directly above the mountain, as the orbital contacts emitted a synchronized pulse that produced a momentary distortion in cloud cover, visible even to civilian observation satellites. The Joint Chiefs authorized a controlled evacuation of adjacent districts under the pretext of hazardous material release, but the timeline for civilian movement was already compromised by the infiltration units advancing through compromised access shafts. Jin-Woo engaged the organism's central node again as it extended a newly formed limb toward the secondary elevator bank, severing the appendage before it could anchor to the upper platform, but the resulting collapse did not produce the stillness required for extraction. The shadow beneath the fallen mass stretched toward him and then dissipated entirely, leaving no viable construct and forcing another measurable expenditure without return. Carter recognized the pattern as systemic resistance rather than individual incompatibility, implying that whatever intelligence directed the incursion had begun to adapt to his conversion parameters. As the outer ring of the Stargate housing finally gave way under the combined pressure of regeneration and orbital reinforcement, fragments of Naquadah alloy sheared off and struck the ramp, and the event horizon flared outward into a shape that no longer conformed to standard transit geometry. The facility's integrity alarms shifted from warning to failure, indicating that the gate room would not remain structurally isolated for much longer. By the time the Stargate's geometry ceased conforming to any known transit configuration, Stargate Command had already initiated a full facility evacuation for all non-essential personnel, because the integrity alarms were no longer predicting collapse, but registering active displacement along the gate room's foundational supports. Dr. Carter's console displayed a cascading series of stress fractures extending from the ramp into the surrounding load-bearing structure, each one widening in sync with the organism's regeneration cycle as additional mass forced its way through the distorted horizon. General O'Neill issued the order to abandon Level 28 entirely, but the directive did not extend to Jin-Woo, who remained positioned at the threshold where the organism's central node continued to articulate. The mana density in the chamber had reached a saturation point that Carter could no longer quantify using standard instrumentation, and the shadows clustered around Jin-Woo began to exhibit a secondary pressure effect that caused several SGC personnel on the upper gantry to stagger even before direct engagement resumed. Teal'c recognized the shift as a command assertion rather than an uncontrolled flare, noting that in Goa'uld theology such a presence would be interpreted as a Monarch-tier entity establishing dominion over contested territory. The difference here was that Jin-Woo's consolidation did not manifest as additional summons, but as an environmental claim that pressed outward from his position toward the organism's advancing mass. Colonel Mitchell's team reported that the infiltration units had reached the outer access tunnels leading to the surface, forcing National Guard detachments to establish a secondary containment line along the mountain's primary exit. Daniel Jackson relayed the update to the command center, with the understanding that any breach beyond that point would result in civilian exposure to off-world biology, a scenario that Earth governments had explicitly ordered SGC to prevent at all costs. The blackout across Colorado Springs had already drawn emergency services into the evacuation zone, and the timeline for full withdrawal was narrowing with each structural failure below. Jin-Woo did not attempt another extraction, as the organism extended a newly formed limb toward the upper platform, instead allowing the shadows to immobilize it long enough for him to reposition via shadow exchange into the path of the central node. The movement carried a visible strain that Carter's readings translated into a sharp reduction in reserve, but the resulting engagement disrupted the harmonic emission for several critical seconds, stabilizing the mana field enough for Teal'c to intercept a secondary advance along the ramp. Above Earth, the two orbital contacts emitted a synchronized pulse that produced a third distortion in atmospheric pressure, visible this time as a localized depression in the cloud layer directly over Cheyenne Mountain, and the embedded transmission within the wormhole shifted into a modulation that Carter could only interpret as a response to Jin-Woo's environmental claim. The observer had begun to engage not with the facility or the organism, but with the Monarch presence itself. As the central node accelerated its articulation in response, drawing additional mass from the distorted horizon, the shadows tightened their formation around Jin-Woo, their posture reflecting a hierarchy preparing for a confrontation that would not be resolved through conventional immobilization. The final escalation did not begin with a new arrival through the distorted Stargate, but with a cessation of the harmonic emission that had defined the organism's advance. Because, for the first time since the override sequence initiated, the mana field within the gate room stabilized without external modulation. Dr. Carter's console registered the absence as a measurable drop in environmental interference, and the shadows clustered around Jin-Woo responded by tightening their formation rather than dispersing, as though anticipating a command that had not yet been issued. General O'Neill, monitoring from the command center above, understood that the confrontation had shifted from a contest of mass and reinforcement to one of direct authority. Jin-Woo stepped forward into the space between the organism's central node and the fractured edge of the ramp, and the pressure radiating from his position intensified into something that caused the remaining infiltration units along the ceiling to hesitate mid-advance. Teal'c recognized the reaction not as fear, but as conflict within a shared command lattice, because whatever intelligence had been directing the incursion was now contending with a presence that did not merely resist its influence, but asserted a competing hierarchy within the same operational domain. The shadows did not move without his direction, but the environment around them began to respond, as though acknowledging a shift in territorial claim. Colonel Mitchell's team reported that the infiltration units in the outer tunnels had ceased their advance entirely, their chitinous forms anchoring in place, as though awaiting further instruction that did not arrive. Daniel Jackson relayed the update with the realization that the layered presence Carter had identified earlier might not be capable of maintaining command under sustained Monarch pressure, especially within a confined terrestrial environment. The blackout across Colorado Springs remained in effect, but the emergency grid began to stabilize as compromised conduits ceased drawing power toward the gate room below. Above Earth, the two orbital contacts broke formation for the first time since their arrival, their emission patterns desynchronizing into separate pulses that Carter could no longer map to the saturated waveform of the wormhole. Air Force radar tracked the divergence as a withdrawal rather than a repositioning, and the atmospheric distortion above Cheyenne Mountain began to dissipate in tandem. The observer had disengaged from the facility's structural framework, leaving the organism below without external reinforcement. Jin-Woo engaged the central node at the moment of desynchronization, his blade intersecting the articulation point that had anchored its regeneration cycle to the distorted horizon, and the resulting collapse propagated through the organism's mass, in a sequence that Carter's instruments could finally interpret as terminal. The shadow beneath the fallen structure stretched toward him without resistance this time, its distortion resolving into a construct that retained none of the organism's chitinous features, but carried the imprint of its coordination function. The extraction succeeded where earlier attempts had failed, and the resulting entity moved to sever the remaining connection between the gate and the residual mass. The distorted event horizon flared once more and then collapsed inward, the Stargate's housing settling into a fractured but stable configuration, as the last of the external mass lost cohesion and disintegrated along the ramp. Teal'c lowered his staff weapon as the infiltration units along the ceiling followed suit, their forms slumping into inert residue that no longer responded to command. The facility's integrity alarms shifted from failure to critical stabilization, indicating that the gate room would hold under current load. Earth did not return to normal in the aftermath, because the evacuation of adjacent districts had already drawn civilian attention to an incident that could not be fully obscured, and the orbital contacts, brief atmospheric distortion, had been recorded by observation satellites beyond SGC's control. Earth governments that had debated oversight now faced confirmation that an off-world intelligence had engaged their planet directly and withdrawn in response to a terrestrial Monarch-tier presence. Jin-Woo did not request alliance or asylum as the shadows repositioned along the ramp, and General O'Neill understood that cooperation would remain conditional rather than assumed, because whatever had observed the confrontation from orbit had now recalibrated its assessment of Earth's defensive profile.